Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, The Complexities of Latinidad in Today's Environment. My name is Kara Marsh-Prophet, and I am the Director of Alumni Operations and Engagement for the University of San Diego's Office of Alumni Relations. I am also a proud USD alumna from the class of 2004, and I believe that most, if not all of you, are USD alumni, so hello and a shout out to my fellow USD grads. Before I launch into introducing today's session, I want to extend hopes and prayers from all your friends in the Office of Alumni Relations and the University of San Diego, that you and your loved ones are safe, healthy, and doing well, despite the challenges we have all been facing these last few months. These are, without a doubt, some of the most challenging times we have faced as a country and as a community. And I just want to let you know that we are thinking about you and praying for you and your loved ones. The Alumni Association staff is continuing our efforts to keep alumni engaged with and connected to the university. Now that we have pivoted to digital engagement, we are able to offer a wide variety of initiatives, from virtual programs such as this, to recorded alumni interviews, to even our tiny Torero's Storytime podcast. In an effort to keep alumni connected and engaged in meaningful conversations, the Latino Alumni Network has partnered with the Alumni Association today to present you with today's program. In that light, I want to share some recent words that were written by USD's president, Dr. James Harris, and provost, Dr. Gail Baker. First, USD is deeply committed to racial justice as an institution and denounces those who perpetuate the agendas of hatred and discrimination. If we are to bring about real and lasting institutional change, our continued investment in this movement must be collective and interconnected in ways that allow expansive solutions to cut across the disciplines. In light of this, and to focus on the work that needs to continue to be done in this area, here are a few updates I thought you all may like to know. An anti-racism task force is being created to continuously expand our scope for institutional and departmental change. Our College of Arts and Sciences, through the Humanities Center, is developing an interdisciplinary course on racism, inequality, and inequality for the fall semester. Modules and readings will be added to faculty development programming for the fall to expand our anti-racist and diversity and inclusion training. Finalists for the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion are being fleshed out. The Vice President will be a member of the President's Strategic Leadership Team and will create a strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion at USD that will advance and sustain the ongoing development of recruitment, climate, professional development, leadership initiatives, and retention practices. And the USD Board of Trustees is engaged in these key diversity initiatives as well. Today's speakers will likely touch on a few of these items. Just a few housekeeping items before we jump right into the session. The interview portion of the program will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel next week. We ask that you please keep your mics muted and turn your cameras off during the interview portion of the event. And we also encourage you to adjust your settings to speaker view. While you're just seeing my face right now, you'll be seeing our featured speakers just here shortly, and want to make sure that you're able to see them clearly. Later on, we will ask each participant to turn on their camera if they'd like, as we move into breakout rooms for about a 15-minute segment of time. After that, we'll move into questions from attendees submitted during registration for Dr. Prieto. If you have any questions that popped up during the Q&A session of our program, please submit them in the chat, and we will do our best to address them if we have time at the end of the event. All right, let's get started. I am happy to introduce Kevin Pelaez. Kevin, if you want to activate your camera and turn on that mic, that would be awesome. There he is. Kevin is an alumnus from the University of San Diego and graduated in 2014 with his degree in mathematics. Last but not least, Kevin is a current president of our Latino Alumni Network. Kevin, thank you so much for leading the charge today. And I'm going to go ahead and kill my camera and mute my mic, and you can take it from here.
Could we get the other slides up too? But hi everyone, I'm Kevin Pelaez. Like Cara said, I graduated in 2014 and I've been involved with USD in many different ways since I graduated, from teaching there and now as the LAN president. Before we get started, I do kind of want to reiterate some of these norms and acknowledgements. First, again, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat message. We'll get to them. We'll try to get to them throughout the conversation. We are in a weird Zoom world now. That doesn't mean we can't have fun and get creative. So if anything really resonates with you, if you like anything you hear, go ahead and send a clap emoji so we can kind of interact at least in that way. And we also want to acknowledge that we're going to share a lot of emotional information, a lot of information that's challenging for some of us to talk about, particularly centered around racism and white supremacy, but also acknowledging that these are conversations that are part of a larger set of conversations. So while we might not have all the answers or talk about everything today, we do kind of want to encourage all of us to continue these conversations within USD as well as outside of USD. Now, a few of the acknowledgements. I want to give a huge shout out to Yahaira and Susan who helped organize this event. I think that without them, we probably wouldn't have made it this far. Also want to talk about the Latino Alumni Network and who we are. So we started right outside of, right after 2014, 2015. A few of us really found that at USD, we had strong connections, whether it be through SSS, through MECHA, through ACHA, through the UFFC, and we kind of wanted to create a space, maybe even a counter space to continue these conversations. So we started off by, again, try to build those conexiones or connections. There are really three main goals that we have right now. The first one is building a network relationship with other alumni. I know that I've gotten to meet a lot of other alumni who have a lot of shared experiences. So maybe I didn't get to meet while in undergrad, but building those relationships has been really nice. The second goal is to start a scholarship. We have a goal of reaching $50,000 so that we can give an endowment and a yearly scholarship. I think right now we're at about $14,000. So we're almost there. It takes a while, but we get there. And then the third one is building mentorship relationships. I would add that with current students as well as with other alumni. Now, one more acknowledgement that I want to give is a land acknowledgement. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's really kind of acknowledging the native land that we're currently residing on. And in this case, for millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land. This land has been nourished, healed, protected, and embraced for many generations in the relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the USD land community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony, and we find inspiration in the land of the Kumeyaay. So this is a statement, I'm going to put it in the chat, that we've modified from other university statements. We really encourage you all to think about what the statement even means, what it means to you. There's actually a link in there to look at the native land that you are currently on. I know that I personally right now am Kumeyaay land, but really want to encourage you all to kind of take this beyond just the original statement. Now, the last thing that I want to acknowledge is that we're in multiple pandemics, right? We have COVID. I would add that there's a climate pandemic, there's a student debt pandemic. The one we really want to talk about today is around systemic racism and white supremacy. So the purpose of today is to provide a space for USD alumni, students, and USD community members to come together and talk about what it means to be Latino and the whole category, and situate that around conversations about Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, colonialism, and white supremacy. I know that if you got to see the flyer, there are two white men on there, so we also want to acknowledge that. I know that I personally have a lot of tensions between identifying as Chicano. For me particularly, I'm kind of like at the intersection of being Mexican, Peruvian, but also living in the borderlands of San Diego. So there's tensions there, and I always like to think about like, where does that situate me within these conversations? And how do my biases and own privilege come into that? So our intention here, or our intention here is not necessarily to speak, or it's definitely not to speak for Black Latinx people, but rather to unfold and expand on some of these issues around systemic racism and white supremacy as a non-Black and non-Black Latinx person. Particularly, there's going to be three things that we talk about. The first one is going to be about what is Latino and what does that even mean? The second one is how is systemic racism and white supremacy manifested within the Latinx community? And the third one is how can we move forward with solidarity with other oppressed groups? Before I get to that, I do want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Greg Prieto, who is our special guest today. So Dr. Prieto is an associate professor of sociology at the University of San Diego. His first book on immigrants under threat, risk, and resistance in the deportation nation was the co-owner of the best contribution to research award granted by the Latino Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. He's done a lot of great work. I had the privilege of getting to know him when I was an undergrad and continuing to work with him as an alumni. He is currently in his 7th year at USD and teaches classes on immigration, criminalizing immigration, race and immigration, sexuality, law, society, and statistics. His activism is mostly centered around supporting LGBTQ youth through the local LGBT center, as well as being involved in the Black Lives Matter movement with the ACLU and other organizations. Can we all give a huge clap emoji to Dr. Prieto as he joins the conversation? There you are. So first of all, how are you? How have the last few months been?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kevin, for having me. Thank you to the organizing team for putting this together. I also see a lot of familiar names, not faces yet, on the participant list. So it's really good to be with former students and friends. The last few months, probably like a lot of people, trying to make it happen, but also with a lot of gratitude for a house to live in, food to eat, and all of that good stuff.
Thank you. And I'm just curious to know if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of like how you came to USD.
Absolutely. So I grew up in a small town outside of Los Angeles. It's like the northernmost suburban outpost for LA County, Lancaster, California, which has been in the news recently for racial violence. So it's a place that I come from that is home, but it's also a place that has always raised the issues that we're going to talk about today in my everyday life. So after college, I went to college at Whittier College, so another small liberal arts school right outside of LA. And then I did my graduate work at UC Santa Barbara. And really in those two places, in college and in graduate school, that was my awakening to activism, to social justice. And it was there that I began to knit together my research interests and my community work. And so my first job after graduate school was here at the University of San Diego, and I've been here ever since, happily situated in the Hillcrest neighborhood of our city.
That's awesome. And I know that I just reading through your classes, it sounded really fun. I wish I could go back and take some.
Oh, Kevin, I wish I could have you back in those classes.
What is one thing that you wish your students would get out of a class with you?
I think we spend a lot of time talking about content knowledge in our classes, right? What the readings are, what statistics you should have in your head, what sort of concrete skills you should develop. And that is all an important part of college education. But I think the other piece that I really want students to take away is a sense of who they are and a sense of what their purpose is. And so for me, that starts with telling the truth about our history, telling the truth about our reality, and then inviting students to situate themselves in that truth. And I think a lot of students already bring that energy, they bring that knowledge, they bring that awareness to my classes. It's just a place where we can be together and kind of amplify and collectivize those voices, right? Offer ourselves a vocabulary for narrating what is happening to us and to how we want to move through the world. And so doing that work, right, of finding our collective purpose as a group, I think is one of the most rewarding things about teaching and is one of the things I want my students to come away with.
That's really interesting. And it reminded me of all the moments that I had with Mecha and with UFMC and SSS and professors and kind of like those community opportunities that we had. I know that's something that really resonated with me while I was at USD was coming to terms with the whole ni de aquí, ni de allá idea. I'm Mexican, I am Peruvian, but also was born and raised in San Diego. So there's a lot of tensions. And I always think of like Gloria Anzaldua's work around Tepantla and what it means to live in that like in between and navigate those tensions.
In each world.
Yeah, right, and like across the multiple worlds. So I guess my first question building off that is really just curious. I'm curious to know what do you think about the term Latino and what does it even mean to be Latino?
Mm-hmm. So let me answer that in a couple of ways. I'll answer it sort of what it means for me personally, and then I want to step back and think about what it means in terms of our racial politics as a country and globe. So I think for me, my relationship to Latinidad, to Latinx identity is really kind of as like an outsider or in this hybrid fashion that you were just describing, Kevin. So I am fourth generation Mexican and Mexican American on my father's side and fourth generation white on my mother's side, mostly German and some other things. But for that reason, my relationship to Latinidad has always sort of been as an outsider in this hybridized fashion. So in my family, Latinx identity is something that's really kind of faded across the generations. And I think that's a fairly common story in the United States. And so while it lived on in these small ways, especially with my grandparents, right? My grandma, when she was with us, used to tell this story all the time about how I used to love her beans as an infant. She would feed them to me, and every bite I would say, right? And she loved telling that story. And it's always sort of stood out to me as one of these kind of very intimate and very familial examples of the connection to the culture that makes up a big part of what we think of as Latinx identity. I have this memory of my grandfather coming to visit me in graduate school in Santa Barbara, and we went to this Mexican restaurant, and of course it's mostly populated by white folks, and we sit down to eat our food, and he's looking around, and he's a veteran of the Korean War, and a man who himself faced a lot of discrimination in his community and at his job, and he looks around and he says, "Mijo, it makes me so angry to see these people eating our food." Right. And so for me, as this kind of like beige kid coming up in a mostly white, very segregated, far-flung suburb of Los Angeles, it was striking to me to have these moments where you were brought into really intimate connection with that heritage, with that ancestry. So in general, I think for me, Latinidad is not exactly a birthright, but something that's closer to like an intentional affiliation. Work that I had to do to learn more about it and connect myself to it. And for me, that's primarily happened through language acquisition. I spent some time living in Mexico to learn Spanish so that I could do the research that I wanted to do here in the US. And it happens through my activism, right? And so what do I see through those experiences? Well, I see at least three big themes, right? And the first of those for me is labor. I saw it in the lives of those Mexican immigrants I worked with in graduate school, in my research and in my activism. I see it all of the time in the service industry. I see it all of the time in food processing. And it reminds me of that line from Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? That immigrants get the job done. Well, if that's true, Latinxes get the job done too. So that the emphasis on hard work has always stood out to me, whether it's from my family members or just from those Latinx folks that I encounter in my everyday life. So I think that's one theme I see. Another big theme I see, and here I'll ask Maya, if you wouldn't mind loading up those slides and pulling up that first one on educational attainment. I think the big second theme for me is sacrifice. And I see this primarily through my students, many of whom are on this Zoom meeting, and who would talk about their motivation for education as an expression of their dignifying their parents' sacrifices. The reason they're in school is to realize the sacrifices that parents made for them. And I think it's that cultural piece that helps us explain why second-generation immigrants in general have higher college graduation rates than the US born in general, right? And you see that there in that circled second set of bars, right? So if we look at the percentage of all those age 25 and older who have graduated from college, we see that for the first generation, it's about 29%. For the second generation is 36%. And then when you compare that to all the US born, it's 31%. So we see that the second generation exceeds expectations, at least relative to the US born, right? And so that pattern we're looking at is for all immigrants, but we would see the same thing for Latinx immigrants also and their children. So I think that element of sacrifice is critical, and we see the payoff in education in data like these. And so those were the two big ones that I kind of held in my head for a long time, but I think there was another piece that I want to bring in here that I did not think of as intimately connected to Latinidad at the beginning, right? And so this really happened in graduate school for me in Santa Barbara, and one of my colleagues who I don't know that I've ever really even shared this with, but his name is Eddie Alvarez. He's a professor at Portland State University, a sort of a complementary type school to USD. And at the time he was writing about queer Latinx spaces, and he was specifically writing about clubs and bars in Los Angeles. And that really began to widen my view of what it meant to be Latinx or Latino in the first place. And I remember going to LA from graduate school in Santa Barbara and going to clubs, right? We would go to Circus when it was still open. And I was stunned to see hundreds of Latinx men, some women, but mostly men, right, in this space, all queer. And then you had different rooms, right? You had the guys in botas in one room, you had hip hop in another room. And what I was experiencing, I think, was a real shock about my own whiteness, about Mexicanness, about Latinidad, right? I had a really narrow vision of the hardworking heterosexual married Mexican laborer in my mind. And that was reinforced in the places I was looking in my research. But here, standing in these distinctly Latinx queer spaces, I saw that intersection. It came to life for me, right? And so this was an early moment of my own awakening to my own racism and how it was narrowing my vision. But it was also really striking to me that these guys looked and dressed like me, right? We had tight fades, earrings, dark jeans. And so it was also this renewed feeling at home. And that simultaneity, right? That kind of awakening to my own myopia, but also beginning to see new places where I could belong was a real transformation for me in what it meant to be Latinx. All right, so that's the personal experience piece. I think we could also zoom out a little bit and talk about what Latinidad means as a racial category and what are some of the complexities in there. And so I would highlight two sets of themes. On the one hand, I think there is a theme of both fluidity and complicity, and I want to hold on to that. And then separately, I want to talk about authenticity and community cultural wealth, or the resilience, I think, that manifests from Latinx identity. Right? And so we're not just talking about racial identity, racial complicity, but I also want to talk about the way that race and ethnicity can be sources of resilience that buffer inequality. So let's take the first of these. Let's take the fluidity and complicity, please. Where would we see it, right? Where does it show up in the data? So here I'll ask Maya to please advance us to that slide on the census. Beautiful. So this is a study from 2014, and what they did is they matched, anonymously, they matched census records from 2010, or from 2000 rather, and 2010, and what they found was that an estimated net 1.2 million Americans, of the 35 million Americans identified as Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, on the census form changed their race from some other race to white between 2000 and 2010, right? So they kept the Hispanic ethnic marker in 2000 and in 2010, but what changed was the racial designation from some other race to white. Maya, would you advance one more slide? That same pattern is borne out here. This is survey data from Pew Research. And what we see is among Americans with Hispanic ancestry, we're looking at the share that identifies as Hispanic or Latino across immigrant generations. So we're really comparing two questions. One question that asks, do you have any Hispanic ancestry at all? And then how do you identify? And then as you can see in that graph, as we move forward in the generations from the first, second, third, and then fourth, we see a steady disaffiliation with the marker Hispanic. And let's jump one more slide. I think I've got a little bit of summary commentary on that point, right? And so these data might provide new evidence consistent with the theory that Hispanics might assimilate as white Americans, closer to the experience of Italians and Irish from generations before, who were not universally considered to be white at the time of their migration, but certainly are today, even though we might regard them as ethnic whites. And it's particularly significant that the shift toward white identification withstood a decade of debate over immigration in the country's exploding Hispanic population, which might have been expected to inculcate or reinforce a sense of Hispanic identity, or draw attention to divisions that remain between Hispanics and non-Hispanic white Americans. So this research suggests that Hispanics who have also experienced discrimination are less likely to identify as white. So while the common experience of racism might reinforce the Hispanic marker, there is this steady disaffiliation, right? And so I think there are two ways that we could think about this. The first is, this is probably the expression of a regular process of assimilation that happens for most, but certainly not all immigrant groups to the United States, whereby language and culture fade over generations, leading Hispanics or the Latinx community to see themselves as more American via language and intermarriage, which is also to say they see themselves as whiter. But notice here the subtlety by which whiteness becomes the American standard, right? The metaphor of the melting pot is probably the predominant one here in the US, but if that's true, it should be said that whiteness is probably the active ingredient. I think there's probably also a less generous interpretation here, right? So Latinxes know, as their own experiences of racism in the US illustrate, that racism is a real force in everyday life. Now, that shared experience can promote solidarity with other racial groups like US Blacks and other people of color under conditions of cooperation. And another sociology colleague of mine, Jennifer Jones, just did a book illustrating how this happens in one community. But the other thing that it can do is promote competition, following Herbert Blumer, this famous sociologist's theory of group threat, right? Or the belief that racism is really competition over one's relative place in the racial hierarchy. And here, Latinxes intentionally or unknowingly approximate whiteness as a pathway to belonging, right? This might explain sometimes why first-generation immigrants across groups vote conservative, even though that vote is counter to their interests, right? Because what you're doing is trying to signal a real belongingness or genuine American patriotism, right? This pattern might also help explain why many Latinxes distance themselves from US Blacks to illustrate their fitness from full inclusion, a theme that I saw in my own conversations with migrant folks on the Central Coast. So let's turn to another example. One of the issues that I had talked with the organizers of this session with quite a bit, and this is the issue of colorism. Thank you, Maya. So what we see in these data are how Hispanic experiences with discrimination differ depending upon skin color. So this is another survey from the Pew Research Group, and here what they did is they put on the screen a series of those little emoji hands that you all use in your text messages all the time, shaded from light to dark. People chose their shade, and then they went through and they answered each of these different survey questions. Do people act as if they were smart? Have you ever been subject to slurs or jokes? People acted as if they were suspicious of them, and so on. And so you can see on the left, we have the response rate for light-skinned Hispanics, or those who chose that lighter hand emoji. And then we see the responses on the far right for darker-skinned Hispanics, or those who chose the darker-skinned emoji. And what you see is that the darker you are, the darker your skin color is, the more prominent your experience of racism, right? This is the reality of colorism in everyday life. And so how might we think about this? Well, we know that dark-skinned Latinxes experience worse outcomes than lighter-skinned folks on the basis of health and income, suggesting, again, the ongoing relevance of Latinidad, not just as an ethnic category, but as a racial category with its own internal hierarchy that is itself racialized. Here I'm reminded of a story that one of the young women that I used to organize a lot with in Santa Barbara would always tell. And she said that when she was born, you know, she was one of 8 grandkids, but she was the lightest, and she was the lightest girl. And her grandma would always call her La Niña Bonita. And that stood out to her, not as anything of any particular relevance as a young person, but growing up and looking back on it, she saw the way that even in her own family, she was privileged as prettier, as nicer, as more agreeable because of her skin color, right? I'm also reminded of my own grandmother who, till the day that she passed, right, dyed her hair blonde after multiple rounds of treatment for cancer. Right? This goes to the ongoing prominence of whiteness and lightness as the pinnacle, I think, of desire. Right? I think there's another example, probably the most direct one, which is the reality of anti-Black racism, which is certainly endemic across the world, but that also means that Mexico and Latin America in general are no exception in this regard. So in the US, many Latinx immigrants learned that setting themselves apart from Blacks is a key way to earn the respect of whites and to avoid being lumped in with the most stigmatized group. In my own research, I often saw this. People would say things like, we're not like those bums in jail or hanging out on the corner, we're here to work. Right? You might also see this in the work of Bonilla Silva, who does a whole chapter on light-skinned Latinxes as honorary whites, as folks who are marked racially as they enter the country, but over time might be able to approximate whiteness. And then the final one, the final example that I want to hold up of the sort of the theme around complicity and fluidity has little to do with the actual individual choices of Latinx immigrants in the Latinx community and more about the US context of reception, right? So moving from the individual to the structural or the national. And I think this fluidity shows up in the way we treat different Latinx groups, right? So for instance, we might remind ourselves of the very generous Cold War refugee and resettlement policy the US extended to Cubans fleeing Castro's communist Cuba, especially the first two waves, which would be distinct from the reception of the Marielitos and the Balseros later in that wave. So we might compare the Cuban experience to the Mexican experience. And this is largely, predominantly a labor migration who have long supported US industry, but as long as Mexicans have been coming to this country, they've also been beleaguered by deportation campaigns and everyday racism. Right? So Latinxes are not different simply because of their internal diversity of culture and creed, although that's important, but also in their treatment by the main receiving country for their immigrants. In other words, racial identity is not only an elective matter of personal choice and culture, but a matter of collective politics. So that's the bit on fluidity and complicity. I want to pivot now to talk about the way Latinx identity or Latinidad can also be a source of authenticity and resilience. So in education, our colleague Tara Yoso, she calls this community cultural wealth, or the way that Latinx culture and heritage actually buffers inequality in education. She talks about the wealth that stems from language. It really helps to be bilingual in this job market. The wealth that extends from family, having housing and emotional support, and the wealth that flows from the lessons of resilience from daily life, right? Being taught persistence at an early stage actually really serves you when you reach institutions of higher education, as I imagine a lot of folks on this Zoom can attest to. I think another way this shows up are in the theses of Latinx revitalization in the context of immigration and the Latinx paradox in the context of health. And what's common to both of these theses or concepts is the notion that Latinx immigrants who immigrate to places of concentrated disadvantage in the US experience better outcomes with regard to health, crime, and education than we would expect for similarly situated US born. Why would we see that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Immigrants' personal motivations for coming to the US. They are a self-selected group of highly motivated, goal-oriented people seeking legitimate opportunities for success. That means that you are part of a self-selected group who are going to get it done, right? What also helps is the establishment of neighborhood institutions. Schools, sports teams, and churches are critical ways that young people are kept on a path to upward mobility. Intact families, and consistent, if low paid and sometimes informal work, as well as a receptive neighborhood context. All of this facilitates immigrant integration and amplifies the protective effect that Latinx heritage, culture, and community can have when it comes to education, health, and crime. And of course, this protective effect is aided by the arrival of new immigrants who often hail from the same cities and towns as those immigrants already living in the United States. And this new wave reinforces those same community and family ties. So in the mainstream, we often hear about the toll that Latinx immigration takes on US communities. I think this is a very narrow view. And when we take that view, we miss the ways that Latinx immigration and Latinx communities actually revitalize our communities and neighborhoods. One more example of this theme of authenticity and resilience, and I think it shows up in the current debate that you're hearing in my own language right now about what we call ourselves in the first place. So we've moved now from Latino, from Latinoa to Latinx, and then increasingly perhaps Latine. And so this debate at present over what to call ourselves could be interpreted in various ways, right? On the one hand, we could interpret this as an academic effort from an American context to neutralize the gendered word Latino in order to decenter masculinity. Some people see this as a white, perhaps a colonial imposition on the Spanish language. Others see it as ways that we struggle to revise our language so that it is genuinely descriptive of all Latinx people. And sometimes we see this in the word Latine, which is a similar effort that emanates primarily from Latin America to achieve the same kind of inclusive goals as Latinx, but in a way that flows better with the mechanics of Spanish itself. Right? So in this case, the fluidity of identity can be understood to deepen what it means to be authentically Latinx by adopting language that genuinely describes all Latinx folks. Right? So here, the central theme that I want to lift up is that identity is not just a feeling or idea we hold in our head or in our hearts, but it's also the outcome of politics or a contest over the proper place of Latinxes in our society. And this can be done in complicity with white supremacy or by actively refusing its invitation. Belonging here is not only about identity, but also about politics.
That's so interesting, right? I think we often talk about Latino as a category, as an encompass all category. When I think many of us know that it's not. It's like you said, it's very fluid. It incorporates multiple dimensions and identities. And I think about social mobility and cultural capital. And you mentioned Tarrios's work around this cultural capital model, but I also think about Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, right? We attach this one number or this one category to people without realizing how dehumanizing that can be. We have I think we're at 33 countries that are identified as Latin American countries, but we use one category and we assume that encompasses everything. And to some of us, it even contributes, like you said, to the erasure of Black communities. It's rooted in colonialism, it's rooted in white supremacy, it's rooted in a lot of these conversations. And there was one thing that really stood out to me. You talked about this proximity to whiteness and what it means to be Latino in terms of the proximity to whiteness. So it made me want to know more about like how does systemic racism and white supremacy look like in the Latinx community?
I think that's a great question, Kevin. So let's take both pieces, right? So what are the ways in which white supremacy oppresses Latinx folks? And what are the ways in which Latinx folks might be complicit with it? So Maya, here, I will ask you to advance the slide. Excellent. So let's take a couple of data points. I want to focus on three. I want to focus on wealth, I want to focus on policing, and I want to focus on segregation. So here we're looking at median family wealth by race and ethnicity from 1963 through 2013. And so on the left, you see the comparison between African American and white, and then on the right, you see the comparison between whites and Hispanic. And so, of course, the big takeaway here is that white folks hold much more wealth than Blacks and Latinos in general. But you'll also notice if you lean into your screen a little bit, you'll see that the value for Hispanic is slightly higher at 13,730 than it is for African American, or 1130. And so the idea here, and this is going to echo, I think, a theme that's going to show up across these slides, is that we often find that on these outcome measures, Latinx folks arrive in in the middle between whites and US-born Blacks. So here we have some data about the racial wealth gap. Let's switch gears and talk about policing, which I know we're going to talk more about today on this call. Thanks so much, Maya. Oh, JK, let's talk a little bit more about racial earnings. So this is average accumulated real lifetime earnings. You see men on the left, women on the right, and then the three major racial groups that are under discussion today anyway, white, Black, and Hispanic. And you see Hispanic men show up again between Black and white men. The pattern is slightly inverted for Hispanic women. Who are the lowest lifetime earners, followed by Black women and then white women. Now let's jump forward and I think we'll see something related to policing. So this is a study out of Stanford's policing project. And here what they did is they wanted to compare the average search rate for whites as compared to Blacks and to Latinos or Latinx folks. And so that dotted black line represents a 10% search rate that is commonly applied to whites. And then what the researchers did is that they plotted the search probabilities, the likelihood that you would be searched across, I think it's 28 states and various jurisdictions within those states, for Blacks on the blue dots and then for Latinos on the green dots. And what we're looking at here is to what degree do Blacks and whites need to trigger the suspicion of police in order to result in a search? So where we see dots above the dotted line, we saw less, this would be a higher level of threshold of suspicion. Below the dotted line is a lower level threshold of suspicion. And that we see these clusters of dots below the white line says to us that the level of suspicion required to search a Black or Latino subject is lower in general than it is for whites, suggesting a racially discriminatory effect. Right. So we see this in policing. Let's pivot one more and look at segregation. These look at segregation figures from 1970 to 2010, and it is done using something called the dissimilarity index. That is along the y-axis or the vertical axis there. And the dissimilarity index measures the degree to which a neighborhood contains the racial diversity that is true of the entire city. Where we see higher levels of dissimilarity, we have less reflection or mirroring between the neighborhood and the city. Where we have lower levels of dissimilarity, we see more similarity between your neighborhood and the broader city. And so we see that the segregation rate for Blacks has come down over time, but is still what researchers call quite high, whereas Latinos fall somewhere in the middle between Asians and Blacks. And that pattern echoes basically what we've been seeing across the slide, which is that when it comes to outcomes across these different variables, we see that Latinos or Latinx folks end up somewhere in the middle. Right? Okay. So what does all of this mean? I think this raises again that possibility of either affinity with US Blacks, with whom many Latinxes share neighborhoods and similar barriers to mobility, or it could suggest proximity to US whites and perhaps a politics of self-preservation and dominance. So indeed, there are ways that Latinx folks approximate whiteness or participate in white supremacy, right? On the more benign end of the spectrum, we see this complicity with white supremacy simply as a management strategy in the face of racism. So for instance, in my own family, my grandparents never taught my dad Spanish so that he would assimilate easier. They wanted him to avoid the experiences of racism that they faced in their youth. And we know that this is a very common experience, especially as you move forward in the generations in Latinx families. So even when assimilation is the result of seemingly value-neutral intergenerational social processes, its valence, or what it is you're assimilating to, is racial. Right? On the more complicit end of the spectrum, we might remind ourselves that the majority of Border Patrol agents in this country are Latinx identified, some of whom are first generation, and who now participate in what is widely regarded as the key gatekeeping mechanism for keeping America white and keeping those of various statuses within the US from achieving full incorporation.
It's so interesting that you bring up the language thing, because I've had conversations with my mom about why she named me Kevin. And it was that proximity to whiteness. And it's so, yeah, it's so hard to acknowledge that. And it was really tough to hear that from her. But I think that there's a lot of learning and unlearning. And I think of myself and like, what have I internalized over time? So it's scary.
I think one of the ways, right, that it becomes hard to have that conversation is, I think in general, we define racism in a very narrow way, right? Racism is an expression of hate from one individual to another, right? But when we think about racism as a structural reality, right, as a series of social processes that unfold over time, we see that you don't need to hold hate in your heart to be complicit with those same patterns. So I would say the same thing about my own grandparents. My grandmother never, it wasn't her goal, I think, to make us whiter as sort of a value that she recognized in her own mind, right? But there is certainly a way in which being in this country taught her that life was easier if you could at least unmark yourself as raced, right? You could take away the Latino identifier. And I think that lesson, while may not be an expression of that internalized hate, certainly allows whiteness to persist as the dominant ideology or as the ideal we're reaching toward.
Yeah, it comes to that whole proximity thing. It's a lot, but that's why we're here, right? Like we're learning and unlearning a lot of the things. I do want to be conscious of time, and I know that we promised a little breakout room session. So I'm going to invite everyone for this second part, we're going to stop recording, and then we're going to go into a few breakout rooms and just have.
Thank you for the question. I'll be brief because I know folks have a lot to offer. I know in my breakout session, we were talking about exactly the themes I'm about to raise. So what can solidarity look like for the Latinx community? I think it starts with a recognition of the commonalities, not just in our culture or in our identities, but in our treatment, right? Whether it's by police, by educational institutions, by banks, wherever we see it. Right, and so though the empirical picture might be slightly better for Latinxes than for US-born Blacks on average, The ongoing reality is that racism comes to bear on the lives of both groups, and that shared treatment can itself be the source of solidarity, right? This is what I briefly flagged to in the work of Jennifer Jones, who's exploring how does that solidarity happen in local communities. I think we can recognize shared dreams for mobility and for opportunity, right? You can see in your Black and brown counterparts that we share a common desire to realize the promise of America as a place of opportunity and progress. I certainly don't think we are there yet, but I think that dream continues to inspire many of us. I think there is room for us to challenge respectability within ourselves, or that the notion that racism can be stopped via good behavior by making oneself presentable to the white majority, right? I think that narrows our focus from a collective response to an individual one, and that's a missed opportunity for politics. I also think because Latinxes, but especially light-skinned Latinxes, white passing folks like me, because we have the opportunity to pursue what Bonilla Silva calls honorary whiteness, the road is especially fraught for us. And there is a powerful temptation to go along with the status quo because it's easier and because the payoffs are more immediate. But I think that by telling the truth about our history, about our experience in this country, another opportunity starts to come into view, right? When we are honest about racial exclusion, about legal subordination, about barriers to opportunity, about the unfairness of social inequality and the refusal of broader society to address it, we see commonalities with Black folks, with Native folks, with queer folks, with working people, and we go on, right? And I think it's this combination of truth-telling and commonality that is a recipe for solidarity and the kind of political coalitions we know we need to rebuild a society where the happenstance of birth plays less of a role in the opportunities that we're afforded so that we can have a real foundation of opportunity for all people. And I think about this in relationship to my work with the Black Lives Matter movement here in San Diego. I recently prepared an op-ed on defunding the police with another colleague of mine and also some community partners here at the ACLU. And as I was writing it, I was thinking about like, what's my motivation here? What is my reason to show up for this movement today? And I think there's a bunch, right? We could talk about my empathy for the place of Black people. We could talk about my responsibility for my role in perpetuating white supremacy. I could think about a really basic desire for less violence in my social world, in my community. And I think about simply like where my taxpayer dollars flow. And so when we pull out to those kinds of broader set of motivations, right, we see that we have multiple bases for solidarity, right? Racial, emotional, political, pacifistic, fiscal. And so when we see politics not only as a matter of identity, but also as a matter of shared interests, the ground for solidarity rapidly expands beneath our feet. All of a sudden, we have more that connects us to each other than perhaps we realized at the beginning. Right? And so racism, for folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's written about this, but for many other people, racism is a grand distraction for people of color, right? And to hate on each other is to allow the great hate to go unchallenged, right? So I think there's room for solidarity there. And then I just always think not just about what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. And I think when you talk to people about the values of genuine opportunity, about fairness, about nonviolence, about justice, that is an expansive ground that can draw us all in. That's a big enough tent to hold all of our different identities.
I want to reiterate that trauma note because it is very real. And it's, I think, part of why we try to make these spaces. I'm going to go as far as calling counter spaces because they aren't necessarily spaces that were created for us. I'm not maybe specifically talking about USD. I'm talking about just general higher education, but actually also USD. So there's a lot of tensions that we're navigating as people of color and as Black and Indigenous and these non-dominant narratives. I want to reiterate the fact that there's a lot of generational work in this. I know that I specifically think of Ana Barrios, of Gibran, of all these people who paved the way when I was there. And it's great seeing a lot of young faces and people that I don't know that are still doing this work. And now Miguel, because I think this wasn't something that just started. I think that just like there's been years of activism, there's been years of racism and systemic racism and white supremacy that got us here, and there's going to be a lot of years left of anti-racism work. So this isn't the final conversation. This definitely is not the last conversation,
I know that we want to continue to make these counter spaces. Just being conscious of time, I do want to share some resources for you all. So I'm going to include this in the chat. So really the first thing is, one thing that we've been really encouraged and working with other affinity groups is encouraging people to donate to the Black Alumni Network Scholarship. I think that's the best and maybe quickest way to give back to the local Black community at USD. I also want to encourage you all to like us on Facebook. That's really our main source of interaction with our alumni, and that's really where we post everything besides word of mouth. And then again, once you hear more events, feel free to share with other people. Let's try to get as many people. We had 120 people registered today, which is amazing. I don't think that I've ever seen 120 Latinos in one space at USD. So it's been great to have this, at least over Zoom. And then the last thing, thank you to Yahaira and Susan again for helping make this event. Thank you to Maya. I don't know, I think that there were a few last minute comments that were going to be made from the Alumni Center. But again, thank you all for participating in this, and we hope to see you at the next event.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you to Dr. Prieto as well. I am going to go ahead and put our little exit slide up here just as something for you guys to look at and read while I make some closing remarks. But I do, again, thank you to Kevin, to Dr. Prieto, to the Latino Alumni Network leadership team. You guys are amazing. Being able to provide these meaningful conversations and spaces for alumni to connect with one another is really what an alumni association is all about. And I really have to give a special shout out to Miguel and to Kevin. You guys both mentioned something that I think is really important and worth repeating. You mentioned paving the way. It's important to recognize that today's students are standing on the shoulders of thousands of alumni who have come before them. They're standing on your shoulders, they're standing on your efforts, they are standing on your experiences. They are experiencing, hopefully, a better place than Miguel experienced, as Dr. Prieto mentioned, and Miguel so kindly shared as well. There was some comments in the chats about the Instagram account that has been recently created, and the letters and that have recently been shared with our alumni population. And I do want you all to know that we will be publicizing a response as an alumni association. And we will be sharing some information with all alumni how the university is addressing these. And we're waiting on that information from university leadership, who I believe actually some of them are meeting as we speak now. So wanted you all to be aware of that, as we also invite opportunities for future programming to continue a critical discussion and create action to make USD a better place. We hope that you'll continue to engage with the university as alumni. Some of the greatest ways to support the university and its students, including our wonderful Latinx students, are mentoring USD students. I share here that down in the below the team mentoring platform, that is Torero Employer and Alumni Mentors. There is a special group within that platform for our Latinx population or community. Thank you again to all of you for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for supporting our USD Latinx population. And one another too. On behalf of the Alumni Association, we're proud of our alumni, and we're proud of the work that you do. That's it on my end.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Prieto. We really appreciate you and everything you've done here.
Thank you for this invitation.